They tell others you were too needy, too emotional, too demanding, unable to give them the space they required, unwilling to accept them as they were. They characterize your expressions of legitimate hurt as you being dramatic or oversensitive. They frame your boundaries as you being rigid or controlling. They position your requests for basic relationship requirements like consistency and emotional availability as unreasonable pressure that made the relationship untenable for them. This villainization of you in their narrative feels deeply unjust because you know the actual history. You accommodated their patterns extensively. You suppressed your needs to manage their comfort. You remained patient through cycles of withdrawal that would have caused most people to leave far sooner. You loved them more generously than their defended limitations allowed them to receive or reciprocate. Yet, despite all that, you have become the bad guy in their story. They've rewritten history to make your needs the problem, not their patterns. The avoidant has engaged in systematic revision of the relationship's history, where your legitimate needs and your reasonable responses to their harmful patterns have been recast as the primary problems that made the relationship untenable. In their narrative, your expression of needing emotional availability becomes characterized as you being excessively needy or clingy. Your hurt about their withdrawal becomes framed as you being unable to respect their need for space. Your establishment of boundaries about treatment you would no longer tolerate becomes positioned as you being controlling or rigid. Your communication about feeling neglected becomes reframed as you applying unreasonable pressure. Your normal emotional responses to their inadequate behavior become characterized as you being too emotional or dramatic. This systematic reframing transforms every instance where you attempted to address legitimate concerns or express authentic needs into evidence of your problematic behavior that the avoidant had to tolerate, or that ultimately made the relationship impossible to sustain. The revision operates through selective memory and recontextualization of events. The avoidant remembers instances when you expressed needs, but conveniently forgets or minimizes the context that generated those expressions, the extended periods of their emotional unavailability that preceded your expression of needing connection, the repeated withdrawals that preceded your communication about feeling abandoned, the consistent pattern of canceled plans or broken promises that preceded your frustration. By extracting your responses from their context, by remembering your reactions without remembering their behavior that generated those reactions, the avoidant constructs a narrative where your needs and your responses appear excessive or unreasonable, rather than appearing as legitimate responses to their inadequate treatment. The rewriting also involves the avoidant characterizing their own patterns in language that obscures their harmful impact, while characterizing your responses in language that emphasizes your supposed problematic nature. Their withdrawal becomes needing space or practicing self-care, while your pursuit of connection becomes being clingy or not respecting boundaries. Their emotional unavailability becomes being independent or being reserved, while your request for emotional sharing becomes being demanding or needing too much. Their pattern of creating distance when intimacy increases becomes maintaining healthy autonomy, while your desire for sustained closeness becomes being codependent or being enmeshed. The linguistic framing transforms identical desires or needs into positive traits when the avoidant demonstrates them, and into negative traits when you demonstrate them, creating a narrative where they were a reasonable person attempting to maintain healthy boundaries, while you were a problematic person making unreasonable demands. The historical revision serves a crucial function for the avoidant's defended self-concept by eliminating their accountability for the relationship's problems and its ending. If the relationship failed because you were too needy, too emotional, too demanding, then the avoidant does not have to face that their defended limitations prevented them from meeting basic relationship requirements. If your needs were the problem, then the avoidance patterns were not the problem. If you were unwilling to accept them as they were, then they did not have problematic patterns requiring change. The revision allows the avoidant to maintain a comfortable belief that they were an adequate partner whose reasonable needs for space and independence were not respected by a partner who wanted too much, rather than facing the uncomfortable truth that they were an inadequate partner whose defended limitations consistently harmed someone who accommodated those limitations far beyond what a reasonable person should tolerate. Why? Accepting the villain role frees you from proving your innocence. The counterintuitive path to freedom involves accepting that you are the villain in their rewritten history, rather than investing energy attempting to prove your innocence or to correct their narrative. The compulsion to defend yourself against their characterization, to explain to them or to mutual connections or to yourself that your needs were legitimate, that your responses were reasonable given their behavior, that you were not the problem they have made you, keeps you bound to their story, keeps you invested in their perception, keeps you oriented toward managing their narrative rather than moving forward into your own life. Accepting the villain role means releasing the need to be understood correctly by them or by others who hear their version. Accept that in their story, you are too needy. You can know that your needs were legitimate while allowing them to maintain their characterization without defending against it. Accept that in their narrative, you were too emotional. You can know that your emotions were appropriate responses to harmful treatment while letting them keep their version without correcting it. Accept that in their revision, you were the problem. You can know the actual truth while releasing the need for them to acknowledge that truth or for others to understand the reality beyond their distorted account. This acceptance liberates you by eliminating the exhausting work of defending yourself. As long as you remain invested in correcting their narrative, as long as you feel compelled to prove your innocence against their villainization, you remain psychologically bound to them and to their perception. You cannot fully move forward because part of your energy remains oriented toward managing their story about you. The acceptance, the willingness to be the villain in their narrative without defending against that role, frees all that energy for your actual healing and your actual forward movement. You are no longer fighting their characterization. You are simply living your life while they maintain whatever story they need to maintain about your shared history. The acceptance also eliminates the power their villainization holds over you. As long as you resist being the villain in their story, as long as their characterization disturbs you or compels your defense, their narrative retains power to affect your emotional state and your behavior. When you accept the villain role, when you become genuinely indifferent to whether they characterize you as needy or emotional or demanding, their narrative loses all power because you are no longer attempting to change it or defend against it. Their story becomes irrelevant noise that does not require your attention or your response. Most critically, accepting the villain role allows you to recognize that being cast as the villain in their defended narrative is actually evidence of your growth rather than evidence of your inadequacy. You became the villain in their story precisely at the point when you stopped accommodating their patterns, when you established boundaries, when you chose yourself over their comfort. The villain role confirms that you finally prioritized your well-being over maintaining their comfortable defended position. Being the villain in their story means you stopped playing the accommodating role their defended position required. This recognition transforms the villain label from something requiring defense into a badge of your healthy growth. You are the villain in a story written by someone who needed you to sacrifice yourself, which means you are actually the hero of your own story, where you finally chose yourself. Your boundaries became abandonment, while their withdrawal was self-care. The avoidant narrative demonstrates a stark double standard where identical behaviors carry opposite moral valuations depending on who performs them. When the avoidant withdraws, creating emotional distance, becoming unavailable, retreating from intimacy, requiring space without explanation or negotiation, this behavior is characterized in their narrative as legitimate self-care, healthy boundary setting, necessary autonomy, reasonable need for space that any partner should respect. Yet, when you establish boundaries, communicating that you will no longer tolerate certain harmful patterns, creating consequences for their inadequate behavior, requiring them to meet basic relationship standards, protecting yourself by reducing your availability after their withdrawal, these identical acts of self-protection become characterized in their narrative as abandonment, rejection, punishment, inability to accept them, evidence that you are not a supportive partner. This double standard operates throughout the relationship and intensifies in the narrative the avoidant constructs after the relationship ends. The avoidant withdraws after you express needs, and this withdrawal is framed as them needing space to process, practicing healthy emotional regulation, maintaining their individuality. You establish a boundary that you need consistency rather than accepting their pattern of sporadic availability. And this boundary is framed as you being rigid, controlling, unable to accept their authentic self. The avoidant cancels plans repeatedly because they feel overwhelmed. And these cancellations are characterized as them honoring their needs and practicing self-awareness. You communicate that you cannot continue accommodating their cancellation pattern and establish a consequence that repeated cancellations will result in you making other plans. And this consequence is characterized as you being unsupportive, punishing them for their struggles, abandoning them when they need understanding. The double standard reveals itself most clearly in how the avoidant characterizes the relationship's ending. If the avoidant ends the relationship, or if they create conditions through their patterns that make the relationship unsustainable, this ending is framed as necessary self-care, them recognizing incompatibility, them being brave enough to acknowledge the relationship was not working, them choosing their well-being. Yet, if you end the relationship, or if you establish boundaries that make the avoidant choose to leave rather than modify their patterns, this ending becomes characterized as you abandoning them, you giving up on the relationship, you being unable to work through difficulties, you rejecting them rather than accepting them. The same outcome, the relationship ending, carries completely different moral weight in their narrative depending on who initiated the ending or whose boundaries precipitated it. The double standard serves to position the avoidant as the perpetual victim of your unreasonable expectations, while obscuring their role as the person whose patterns consistently harmed you. In their narrative, they are a reasonable person with normal needs for autonomy and space, attempting to maintain healthy boundaries, while you are a demanding person with excessive needs for closeness and emotional availability who could not respect their boundaries. This framing inverts the actual power dynamic, where you accommodated their patterns extensively while they provided minimal reciprocal accommodation. Where you stretched to meet their defended needs while they refused to stretch to meet your legitimate needs. Where you sacrificed your boundaries repeatedly while they maintained rigid defended boundaries that protected their comfort at the cost of your well-being. Why embracing their villain label protects your boundaries? The path to protecting your boundaries involves embracing rather than defending against the avoidance characterization of your boundary setting as abandonment. The avoidant wants you to internalize their double standard, to accept that their withdrawal is legitimate while your boundaries are abandonment, to feel guilty about establishing consequences for their harmful patterns while they feel entitled to create distance whenever intimacy exceeds their comfort. This internalization would keep you trapped in a dynamic where you perpetually accommodate their boundaries while suppressing your own, where you respect their needs while your needs remain perpetually unmet, where you accept their characterization that establishing boundaries makes you a bad partner. Embracing the villain label, accepting that in their narrative, your boundaries are abandonment, protects your boundaries by eliminating the guilt and the self-doubt that the avoidance characterization is designed to generate. Yes, in their story, your boundary was abandonment rather than self-care. Accept this characterization without defending against it, without attempting to make them see that your boundary was legitimate while theirs was harmful. Their inability or unwillingness to recognize the difference between your boundary and their withdrawal is their limitation, not your problem requiring correction through defending yourself or through softening your boundaries to avoid their characterization. The embrace protects your boundaries by making you immune to the manipulation inherent in the double standard. As long as you resist being characterized as abandoning, as long as you need them to acknowledge that your boundaries were legitimate self-care, you remain vulnerable to softening those boundaries when they characterize them as abandonment. When you embrace the villain label, when you accept that yes, in their story, your boundary is abandonment, and you are comfortable being cast as someone who abandoned them by refusing to continue tolerating harmful patterns, you become immune to this manipulation. They can call your boundary abandonment. You no longer care about correcting their characterization because you are secure in knowing your boundary was necessary self-protection, regardless of how they choose to frame it. The embrace also protects your boundaries by eliminating the avoidance power to make you question your own perceptions through their double standard. When they can successfully convince you that their withdrawal is self-care, while your boundaries are abandonment, they distort your reality in ways that make you doubt your own legitimate needs and your own appropriate responses to harmful treatment. When you embrace being the villain in their narrative, when you accept their characterization without internalizing it as truth, you protect your reality from their distortion. You maintain a clear perception that boundaries protecting you from harm are legitimate, regardless of how they characterize those boundaries. Most critically, embracing the villain label of being the abandoner when you established boundaries confirms that your boundaries were effective. You became the abandoner in their story precisely because your boundaries threatened their comfortable dynamic, because your consequences for their patterns made continuing the relationship on their defended terms impossible. Because your refusal to continue accommodating their withdrawal as legitimate while accepting the characterization of your boundaries as problematic disrupted the double standard they relied upon. Being cast as the villain who abandoned them through establishing boundaries means your boundaries actually worked to protect you, rather than being performative gestures they could ignore or manipulate you into softening. The villain label confirms your boundary was a real threat to their defended position, which means the boundary was serving its function of protecting you. They need you to be the villain to avoid facing their own accountability. The avoidance construction of a narrative where you are the villain serves an essential psychological function. It allows them to avoid facing accountability for their defended patterns, for the harm those patterns caused you, for their role in the relationship's failure or ending. Facing genuine accountability would require the avoidant to acknowledge that their patterns harmed someone who cared about them, that their defended limitations prevented them from being an adequate partner to a person who accommodated those limitations extensively, that they made ongoing choices to prioritize their defended comfort over your legitimate needs, that the relationship ended because of their incapacity rather than because you were inadequate or demanding. This accountability would generate guilt and shame that the avoidance defensive structure exists specifically to avoid experiencing. The construction of a narrative where you are the villain eliminates the need for this accountability by repositioning the relationship's problems as your fault rather than as a consequence of their defended patterns. The villainization operates through projection, where the avoidant attributes to you the problematic qualities and behaviors that actually characterize their own patterns. They accuse you of being emotionally unavailable when they were the one who consistently withdrew. They characterize you as unable to communicate when they were the one who deflected vulnerable conversations. They position you as not respecting their boundaries when they were the one who consistently violated yours by expecting accommodation without reciprocation. They claim you are not supportive when they provided minimal support for your struggles while expecting extensive support for theirs. This projection allows the avoidant to acknowledge problematic relationship dynamics while locating those problems in you rather than in themselves, maintaining their defended self-concept as a reasonable person while casting you as the unreasonable one. The villainization also serves to generate sympathy and support from others that validates the avoidance narrative and shields them from external accountability. When the avoidant tells friends or family or new partners that you were too needy, too demanding, unable to give them the space they required, these confidants typically respond with validation that reinforces the avoidance narrative. They confirm that the avoidant was right to leave such a demanding relationship. They express sympathy for what the avoidant endured. They support the avoidance characterization without hearing your perspective or understanding the actual dynamics. This external validation insulates the avoidant from having to question their narrative or face that their characterization inverts reality. The social support makes the false narrative feel more real, makes the avoidant more confident in their villainization of you, because others accept and reinforce that characterization. The need to make you the villain particularly intensifies if the avoidant maintains some awareness at a deeper level that their patterns were the actual problem. The avoidant who has sufficient self-awareness to recognize that their withdrawal harmed you, that their emotional unavailability left your needs unmet, that their defended limitations prevented them from being an adequate partner, experiences cognitive dissonance between this awareness and their need to maintain an acceptable self-concept. The villainization of you resolves this dissonance by constructing a counter-narrative where your problematic behavior was the real issue, allowing the avoidant to suppress or discount their awareness of their own patterns by focusing on the characterization of your supposed inadequacy. The more intensely they need to avoid their own accountability, the more extremely they will villainize you to maintain the defensive narrative. The villain role is temporary, but your freedom from their story is permanent. The avoidant's need to maintain you as the villain in their narrative will diminish across time as their psychological investment in that narrative decreases, as they move forward into new relationships or new circumstances. As the emotional intensity of the ended relationship fades, and with it fades the urgent need to justify their patterns or avoid their accountability through villainizing you. The extreme characterization where you are an unreasonable, demanding, emotional person who made the relationship impossible will soften into a more neutral assessment, where the relationship simply did not work, where incompatibility existed, where both parties contributed to problems. The avoidant may eventually develop the capacity, through therapy or through accumulated relationship failures, to face some accountability for their patterns. They may recognize in retrospect that their characterization of you was distorted. They may acknowledge to themselves or others that you were not actually the villain they needed to make you when the relationship ended. The villain role in their story is temporary because it serves a time-limited function of managing their psychological state during and immediately after the relationship's ending. Once that period passes, once their defensive need for the narrative decreases, the extreme villainization typically softens, even if some elements remain. Yet your freedom from their story, the liberation that comes from accepting the villain role without defending against it, from releasing investment in their perception of you, from moving forward into your own life regardless of how they characterize your shared history, is permanent if you protect it through maintaining your disengagement from their narrative. The freedom emerges not from waiting for them to soften their characterization or eventually acknowledge the truth, but rather from your decision that their characterization is irrelevant to your life, that their story about you does not require your attention or your correction, that you are living your actual life rather than managing your reputation in their distorted account of your relationship. This freedom, once achieved through accepting the villain role and releasing the need to be understood correctly by them, remains available to you regardless of whether they eventually shift their narrative or whether they maintain their villainization indefinitely. The permanence of your freedom depends on your continued refusal to re-engage with their narrative. The temptation will arise periodically to check whether their characterization of you has softened, to feel vindicated if you discover they have developed a more accurate perspective on the relationship, to feel hurt if you discover they maintain their villainization even years later. Yet engaging with their narrative in any form, even to discover they have shifted toward a more accurate characterization, threatens your freedom by reactivating your investment in their perception. Your freedom requires complete release, where their story about you becomes genuinely irrelevant, rather than becoming something you track, even if only to feel validated when they eventually acknowledge the truth. The permanent freedom also involves recognizing that their eventual softening of characterization, if it occurs, does not represent a vindication you should wait for or an investment you should make. Some people hope that if they maintain dignity, if they refuse to defend themselves, if they simply live well, the avoidant will eventually recognize their error and will acknowledge that the villainization was false. Yet this hope represents continued investment in their perception, continued orientation toward their narrative, continued belief that their acknowledgement matters to your healing or your sense of self. True freedom involves releasing any hope that they will eventually see the truth, accepting that whether they shift their narrative or maintain it indefinitely is irrelevant to your actual life. Recognizing that you do not need their acknowledgement to know your own truth or to live your own story.